Grace Miller saw the red words on her front door on a cold, damp Sunday morning, when the fog still lay low over the grass in front of her porch like a dirty sheet. No one had bothered to lift, and the rooftops of Ashford Falls were still submerged in the bluish gray of a Vermont morning that was not quite winter, but no longer gentle enough to be called autumn. She was wearing the simple navy dress she always wore to church, a cream cardigan over her shoulders, her hair pinned neatly at the back of her neck, one hand holding the worn hymnal with the fraying spine, the other still reaching for her car keys in the ceramic bowl beside the door, the place where she always kept small things so her feet would not slip into chaos. Her mother, Ruth, was still asleep in the back room, the heater murmuring softly inside the walls. The kettle on the stove just switched off, and Grace had meant to stop by the church earlier than usual to help arrange the music sheets for the choir, as she had done for nearly 20 years without anyone asking, without anyone needing to thank her. But when the door opened, the whole morning seemed to stop in front of her. On the white wood of the porch door, a cream-colored sheet of paper had been taped up with red tape, all four corners pressed down so tightly the paper had wrinkled, and across it, in thick red marker, were the words, "Shame knows where you live. Shame knows where she lives." At her feet, the pot of daffodils she had placed on the porch 3 days earlier had been crushed underfoot. Black soil scattered across the white wooden steps. The soft yellow petals ground into the mud like something small being punished for daring to bloom at the wrong person's door. Grace stood frozen, the hymnal in her hand growing heavy as a stone. The first thing she felt was not anger. It was not fear. The first thing was shame, hot and silent, crawling up her throat before she even had time to ask herself what she had done wrong. And in that very moment, before she could tear the paper down, before she could call the police or Caleb or Lena or anyone at all, she understood that Ashford Falls had already won its first victory, because the town had made her feel dirty with nothing more than a piece of paper on a door, even though her only sin was loving a man they had long ago decided no one was allowed to love. The phone in her coat pocket kept vibrating, each short pulse like a fingernail tapping against bone. The first message came from the choir group, but no one said her name directly. A woman named Donna simply wrote, "Maybe we should let Grace rest this morning. Everyone pray for discernment." Then came 3 folded hands emojis, followed too quickly by a string of replies. Amen, praying for all involved. So heartbreaking when good women lose their way. The second notification was an email from the dental clinic where she worked part-time as a bookkeeper. "Dear Grace, due to a few concerns regarding the professional environment and unwanted attention in the community, we think it would be best for you to take a few days off until things settle down." The words "concerns" and "settle down" appeared neat, kind, clean, as if someone were helping her preserve her dignity while quietly taking it from her. The third was a screenshot from the Facebook group Ashford Falls Community Watch. The photo had been taken from a distance, a little blurry, but clear enough to show her walking out of Caleb Ward's woodshop the night before, wearing her brown coat, holding a paper bag, warm yellow light spilling from the workshop door behind her. Caption was only one sentence. "Some people never learn from history." Below it, comments had sprouted like poisonous mushrooms after rain. No one said outright that Grace had done anything wrong, because polite people in a small town rarely needed to say things outright. They only wrote about certain women, lonely hearts, dangerous men, poor Evelyn, and how quickly a decent reputation can fall. Grace stared at the screen until the words blurred, then she lifted her eyes out of an old instinct, the instinct of someone who had lived her whole life in a small town and knew every window had eyes. Across the street, behind the white lace curtains of the large pale yellow house, Margaret Bell was standing with a coffee cup in her hand, wearing a pale blue silk robe, her silver hair softly curled to perfection even this early in the morning. She did not hurry to hide. She looked at Grace with a pity she had practiced for years, the kind of look that said she had done nothing at all, that the red note, the crushed flowers, and the Facebook photo were simply the natural consequences of unfortunate choices. Grace bent down and picked up a broken daffodil. The petals went limp in her hand. For the first time in her life, she did not know whether she should go to church or lock the door and hide inside. Before Caleb Ward's name clung to her like an ink stain that would never wash out, Grace Miller had been the most ordinary woman in Ashford Falls. And ordinary in that town was not a small description, but almost a kind of virtue. She did the bookkeeping for Dr. Helen March's dental clinic 3 days a week, kept the accounts for the church's fall fair, sang alto in the choir, cared for her elderly mother, who had arthritis and occasional chest pain, and lived in the small white house her father had left her at the end of Maple Street, where every summer she repainted the fence even when she cowled. Dee only afford the cheaper paint. Grace was not wealthy, not beautiful in the way that made people turn their heads at the diner, not loud, and not possessed of the kind of romantic life that gave people something to whisper about. She was the woman people called when someone needed a casserole after a funeral, when the church women's group needed someone to check receipts, when the mother of an elementary school child needed to borrow folding tables for a bake sale. She was always on time, always took careful notes, always remembered who was allergic to peanuts, who didn't eat gluten, who had just lost a beloved dog, who needed a seat near the exit because of a bad hip. People loved her because she made everything easier, while rarely forcing anyone to see how tired she was. For years, Grace believed that was community love. Only later would she understand that Ashford Falls had not loved her as a whole person. They had loved her role, the kind, single, trouble-free woman who did not ask hard questions and did not stand beside anyone the town had exiled from its collective mercy. Her good reputation was a soft cage, lined with compliments, church cookies, and pats on the shoulder after Sunday service. As long as she lowered her head and walked past gossip, as long as she made no one uncomfortable, as long as her kindness served other people's peace, the town held her close. But a conditional embrace is still a hand around the throat when people decide to tighten it. The name Evelyn Ward had always existed at the edge of Grace's life, like an old water stain on the church ceiling. Not always visible, but known to everyone. In the hallway behind the church fellowship room hung a framed photograph from the winter fundraiser 12 years earlier, the last photograph Evelyn appeared in before she died. She stood beside Mayor Richard Bell, Pastor Jonathan Reed, and Margaret Bell, wearing a black dress, her dark red hair tied low, a small silver necklace at her throat with a teardrop-shaped pendant. Evelyn was smiling in the picture, but her eyes were not fully smiling. Grace had passed that photograph many times while carrying trays of cookies or stacking folding chairs, and every time someone nearby was talking, their voice naturally lowered. People said Evelyn died at 1:17 in the morning on River Bend Road, her car slipping off the small bridge in the cold rain after the church fundraiser. People said she and Caleb had argued earlier that night. People said Caleb was a difficult man, silent, angry in a frightening way because he never exploded in front of others. The police ruled it an accident, but Ashford Falls did not need the police to reach its own verdict. For 12 years, Caleb Ward became the cautionary tale told in whispers. The man with the wood shop at the edge of town. The man no one invited to parties. The man who repaired things for the church but never sat in the pews. The man mothers warned their daughters not to walk past after dark. Grace had believed some of it too, not because she knew anything, but because gossip repeated long enough in a small town eventually begins wearing the clothes of truth. She truly met Caleb one October afternoon when Dr. Helen asked her to bring a folder of tax documents to his wood shop, because the old man who used to handle Caleb's books had gone into the hospital, and Caleb did not know how to correct an error in his income report. His workshop stood at the edge of Mill Road, near the old creek, a long tin-roofed building with a heavy wooden door, the smell of sawdust and linseed oil drifting out the moment he opened. Caleb Ward did not look like the monster from the stories. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with brown hair threaded with silver at the temples, steady gray eyes, and hands marked by calluses and small-heeled cuts. He spoke little, but he was not cold. He invited Grace in with a nod, wiped his hands on a cloth, and placed the documents on a work table dusted with fine wood powder. Late afternoon sunlight came through the dirty windows, falling in golden strips over chairs being restored, a wardrobe missing one door, and several church window frames taken down for repair. Grace saw a broken church pew in the corner, its old wood carefully sanded smooth. "Are you repairing that for the church?" she asked, trying to keep her voice neutral. Caleb followed her gaze and nodded. "They asked if I could do it cheap. And you agreed? Old things are still worth fixing if the frame hasn't rotted." He said it without looking at her, as if he were only talking about the pew. But Grace heard something else in it, a dry, hard sadness like old wood. She helped him correct the papers, explained the numbers, and he listened closely, never pretending to understand when he didn't, never joking to cover his awkwardness. When she accidentally touched the silver necklace resting in a small box on a shelf, His face changed so quickly that she drew her hand back. "I'm sorry," she said. Caleb stepped forward, took the box, and closed the lid. "It's fine," but it was clearly not fine. When Grace left the workshop, dusk had begun to fall, and the scent of wood followed her outside. In the distance, in front of Margaret Bell's flower shop, a figure stood still for a long time. Grace did not need to look closely to know it was Margaret. The first warning did not come in the form of the red note, but in the form of weak coffee and dry cookies after choir practice. Margaret Bell pulled Grace aside in the church fellowship room, where folding chairs were being stacked. Women were laughing softly, and the smell of dish soap mingled with candle wax. Margaret placed a hand on Grace's elbow, lightly enough that if Grace pulled away, she would be the one who looked rude. "Dear Grace, I just wanted to say a few words because I care about you." That was how Margaret always began, with concern used as wrapping paper around a knife. Grace smiled out of reflex. "Yes, is something wrong?" Margaret sighed very softly, her pale blue eyes full of pity. "I heard you went to Caleb Ward's workshop. I brought him tax papers. Doctor, Helen asked me to. Of course, I don't think badly of you. No one thinks badly of you, at least not yet." The two words, "not yet," landed very lightly, but Grace heard them clearly. Margaret went on. "It's just that, lonely men have a way of softening kind women, especially women who are used to taking care of others. And your reputation is precious, Grace. In a small town, reputation is something a woman should never set too close to fire." Grace felt her face grow hot. "I'm not setting anything close to fire." Margaret smiled, but her eyes did not. "I know, I'm only worried about you." That word, worried, left Grace with no clean way to respond. If she got angry, she would seem ungrateful. If she stayed quiet, Margaret's story would settle over her like a dirty coat. That night when she came home, she found an old newspaper article slipped through the mail slot. An article about Evelyn Ward's death. The paper had yellowed, but the headline was still sharp. "Local woman dies after church benefit. Questions remain." The sentences in the article did not accuse Caleb, but they led the reader right to the edge of a cliff and then pretended not to push. "A troubled marriage. An argument earlier that evening. No charges filed." Grace read it at the kitchen table, rain tapping on the porch roof, Ruth asleep in the next room. She looked at Evelyn's photograph in the article, the silver necklace at her throat, and a sense of unease began to take root. Was she romanticizing a dangerous man just because he repaired church pews and spoke softly? Was the whole town wrong? Or was she arrogant to think she could see what they did not? That was when Ruth came into the kitchen, a robe around her shoulders, her white hair messy at the back of her head. She looked at the newspaper and went still. "I remember that night," Ruth said. Grace looked up. "You were at the fundraiser?" Ruth nodded slowly. "I helped clear tables, and that night, Caleb wasn't the only one lying." Ruth told the story under the yellow kitchen light, her voice hesitant at first, as if after 12 years the memory still had other people's ear. "The night Evelyn died, the church had been packed for the fundraiser for a women's shelter in the next county, a project Evelyn had cared about deeply. Ruth had been stronger then, helping in the kitchen with Lena Ortiz and a few other women, carrying coffee, collecting plates, wiping tables. She remembered Evelyn passing through the back hallway with her face white, clutching a brown envelope against her chest. She heard arguing in the small office beside the storage room. A low male voice, and Evelyn's voice trembling with anger. Ruth did not see the man, but she clearly heard Evelyn say, "If you don't tell them, I will." Then Evelyn came out quickly, bumped into the side table, and dropped the envelope. Margaret Bell picked it up before Ruth could bend down. "Did she give it back to Evelyn?" Grace asked. Ruth looked down at the teacup in her hand, her fingers trembling slightly. "I'm not sure. Pastor Reed called me back into the kitchen because someone had spilled coffee. When I turned around again, Evelyn was gone." Margaret was standing by the office door, empty-handed. Ruth let out a long, tired breath. "That year I told someone. They said I was old, that I must have misheard, that I shouldn't hurt Evelyn's family any more than they'd already been hurt. So I kept quiet. I was like everyone else, Grace. I kept quiet because this town teaches women that if speaking makes the room uncomfortable, the fault is theirs." Grace sat for a long time after her mother went back to bed. The newspaper lay on the table. In the photograph, Evelyn stood beside the most moral people in Ashford Falls. Mayor Bell smiled broadly. Pastor Reed had one hand on a child's shoulder. Margaret stood elegantly, gloved hands folded. Grace looked at the silver necklace around Evelyn's throat and remembered Caleb's reaction when she had touched. The next day, she went to the wood shop and asked him about the brown envelope. Caleb was sanding a tabletop, his movements steady and practiced. When he heard the question, he stopped. The temperature in the workshop seemed to change. "Where did you hear about that? My mother remembers a few things. Your mother should forget. Did Evelyn discover something?" Caleb looked at her, his eyes darkening. "Don't dig into this. What if everyone has been wrong about you?" He gave a small, joyless laugh. "You think people stop saying the wrong thing just because you find the right one?" Then he turned back to the table, as if closing a door right in front of her. But Grace did not stop, or rather, she tried to stop. But life began pulling her toward Caleb in quiet ways. Ruth needed the rocking chair Grace's father had built repaired, and no one in town fixed wood better than Caleb. Grace brought the chair over, telling herself it was only practical. Caleb did not ask many questions. He examined the leg and said the wood was still good, only the pins needed replacing. Ruth wanted to pay, but Caleb said the chair had already paid the town enough by keeping an old woman seated through the winter. Grace laughed before she could be careful. After that, she brought him bread from the diner because Lena had made too much, then stayed 5 minutes, 10 minutes, half an hour. They talked about broken old things, about what could be fixed by hand, and what people only kept because memory would not let them throw it away, about Grace's father, Caleb's mother, and long winters when snow made every sound in town seem as if it were speaking through a wall. Caleb did not flirt. He did not use his sorrow to pull her closer. Some days he even said plainly, "You shouldn't let them see you here." Grace looked at the streaks of sawdust on her hand. "I've lived in this town almost 40 years. I'm tired of asking their permission to stand somewhere." Caleb looked at her for a long time, as if the sentence both frightened him and made him want to believe. Their affection grew in silence, between the smell of wood, rain on the tin roof, and all the spaces neither of them dared to name. Grace found that with Caleb, she did not have to perform the role of the pleasant, kind woman. She could ask directly, could be angry when he avoided things, could sit still without filling the room with usefulness. Caleb did not look at her as if she were part of Ashford Falls, but as someone who had walked into his workshop on her own and had the right to walk out on her own. That was what made her love him before she had time to protect herself. And on the very evening she left the shop with the paper bag Caleb had packed the repaired rocking chair pieces in, someone took the first photograph. The photograph spread the next morning like fire under dry leaves. No one in the Facebook group wrote, "Grace Miller is sleeping with Caleb Ward." They didn't need to. A woman named Carol posted, "Some people never learn from history." Another commented, "Poor Evelyn must be turning in her grave." Someone else wrote, "Loneliness can make decent women forget common sense." Margaret did not comment right away. She let others clear the path. By afternoon, she wrote only one sentence. "Let us pray for discernment and protection for the vulnerable." That sentence made Grace want to throw her phone against the wall. Vulnerable, as if she were a weak woman being lured by Caleb, not a grown adult who knew what she was doing. At the clinic, patients fell silent when she walked into reception. "Doctor," Helen closed her office door and said, in a regretful voice, that Grace should protect the professional image, that the clinic did not judge anyone's private life, but that the community was very sensitive, and sometimes stepping back was the best way to show people you were being thoughtful. At church, Donna had taken Grace's place in the choir, just temporarily. At the diner, Lena looked at her with a worried, awkward expression. "Gracie," Lena said, using the nickname from high school, "I know you have a good heart, but Caleb Ward is a bottomless pit in this town. Closer you get, the more stones people will throw down." Grace asked quietly, "Do you think he killed Evelyn?" Lena looked out the window, where 2 elderly women were pretending not to listen. "I think in this town there are some questions it's best not to become the person asking." That night, Grace received an anonymous text. "Ask him what happened to Evelyn's money." The message was unsigned. Grace read it again and again. Evelyn's money, not the deaths, not the accident. Money, a very ordinary word, very dirty, very hard to turn into morality. The opportunity arrived in the form of something Grace had done dozens of times before without anyone noticing. Reviewing the accounts for the church's fall fair. Pastor Reed had not yet removed her from that job, perhaps because he thought she was too obedient to do anything but add and subtract in the correct columns. The church storage room sat behind the basement, smelling of damp paper, old candles, and choir robes that had hung too long. Grace sat among dust-covered boxes, at first only looking for this year's receipt, but the anonymous text still lodged in her mind like a thorn. She opened the box from the year Evelyn died. The fund ledger had been written in two kinds of ink. The first part of the year was neat and even, while the later pages had several corrections in another pen. The money raised for the women's shelter, nearly $32,000, had been recorded as transferred to an organization called Northern Haven Outreach. But the attached receipt was only a photocopy with no complete letterhead, no contact number, and approval signatures from Pastor Jonathan Reed and Richard Bell, who had not yet become mayor but was already head of the town council. Grace checked the columns again. The numbers did not match. There was a cash withdrawal 2 days before the final fundraiser, marked emergency relocation support, but no record of who received. She took photos with her phone, her hand shaking more than she wanted. Just then, the storage room door opened. Pastor Reed stood there in a white shirt and brown cardigan, his gentle, familiar face the same one Grace had listened to preach about mercy for years. "Grace," he said softly, "what are you looking for?" It was not an accusing voice. That made it more frightening. Grace shut the ledger too quickly. "I'm checking fare receipts." Pastor Reed looked at the old box, then at her. "This year's fare isn't in that box." A very small silence. Grace heard the old heater clank inside the wall. "I pulled the wrong one," he smiled. "Perhaps you should come up to my office for a moment. I think we need to talk." Pastor Reed's office had an old brown carpet, a wooden cross on the wall, a bookcase full of Bibles and pastoral care books, and a door that was closed but not locked. He invited Grace to sit and placed a glass of water in front of her, though she had not asked for one. "I know you're going through a difficult time," he said. Grace sat straight back. "I'm fine. No one is fine when the whole community is talking. And I don't say that to blame you." He folded his hands on the desk. "But sometimes, when we're hurting, we reach for stories that give us the feeling of control. Evelyn's death is an old wound. Her family has suffered enough. Caleb has suffered too, in his own way. Digging those things up may not heal anyone." Grace looked at the cross on the wall. "What about the truth?" Pastor Reed sighed, like a patient father speaking to a daughter who did not understand the world. "The truth does not always heal." Grace looked at him. For the first time, something a pastor said in Ashford Falls did not make her feel guided, but as if someone were building a wall in front of her. "And sometimes," he continued, "what people call truth is simply personal feeling dressed up as justice. I worry that your feelings for Caleb are making you view things through a dangerous lens." Grace felt her stomach tight. He had said feelings, as if it were an illness. "I think it would be best for you to step back from the audit team this year," he said, "just to keep everything clear. For your mother, your work, your reputation." When Grace left his office, Margaret Bell was standing in the hallway, holding a bouquet of white flowers for the church. She looked at Grace with a small smile. "Did Pastor help you feel more at peace?" Grace walked past her without answering. Behind her, Margaret said very softly, "Grace, people can always turn back before they go too far." It sounded like an invitation, but Grace heard the sound of a lock turning inside. That night she went to Caleb's workshop in heavy rain. The hanging light swayed slightly in the wind, and the smell of wet wood and linseed oil was heavier than usual. Caleb opened the door, looked at her face, and did not ask why she had come. "Evelyn found out the charity money was being stolen," Grace said immediately, without taking off her coat. Caleb stood still. "You knew," not a question. He looked down at his hands. "You should go home. You knew." She repeated it, her voice shaking with anger. "You let the whole town call you your wife's killer for 12 years. But the part about the money you never said." Caleb turned away, went to the work table, and placed his hands on the wood as if he needed something solid to keep him standing. "You think I didn't want to say it? I don't know what you wanted. You never say anything." A long silence. Rain hammered the tin roof like thousands of fingers. At last Caleb spoke, his voice low. "Evelyn found out money from the shelter fund had been moved into a fake organization. She found copies of statements, a few emails, Richard Bell's name, Pastor Reed's name, a few others. She wanted to expose it at the fundraiser. I told her to wait. I told her if she stood up without enough evidence, they would crush her. We fought. She said I was a coward, said I cared more about what people thought than about the truth. She left with the envelope." He swallowed. "I let her leave." Grace softened for 1 second, then the anger came back sharper. "After she died," Caleb gave a dry laugh. "After she died, everyone looked at me as if I had pushed her car off the bridge with my bare hands. Anything I said would sound like a husband, inventing a story to save himself. Evelyn's family hated me. Clara wanted me hanged if the law allowed. The police closed the file. Pastor Reed told me I should let the dead rest. Richard Bell looked at me at the funeral and said sometimes the only way to atone is silence. Grace felt cold. And you listened? I had fought with her before she died. I hadn't believed her quickly enough. I listened because part of me believed I deserved it. Grace stood before him, wet from the rain, angry enough that her eyes stung. You didn't just punish yourself. You let Evelyn be buried under the wrong story. Caleb closed his eyes. I know. It did not save anything, but it was true. He went to the shelf and took down the small box containing the silver necklace. She left this at home that night. I never opened the pendant. I didn't want to break the last thing of hers I still had. Grace took the necklace, her hand trembling. The teardrop pendant had a tiny seam. She opened the clasp with her fingernail. Inside, folded very small, was a yellowed slip of paper with a number and the name of the local bank. Caleb looked at the paper as if Evelyn had stepped out of the wall. A safe deposit box, Grace said. The Ashford Falls bank the next morning was quiet in the particular way only a small-town bank can be, with polished wood counters, a slow-ticking wall clock, and employees who knew everyone's parents before they checked anyone's paperwork. Caleb had still been Evelyn's legal husband when she died, so in theory he had the right to ask about an old safe deposit box. But the marriage records were not showing in the digital system. The authorization files needed to be checked. And the bank manager, Warren Pike, had a light sweat above his upper lip when he saw the number in Grace's hand. Boxes from more than a decade ago sometimes get moved into storage, he said. Caleb placed both hands on the counter. You know me. You knew Evelyn. Warren did not look him in the eye. I'm just following procedure. A few hours later, Caleb received a call from Mayor Richard Bell. Grace stood beside him in the workshop, listening to the mayor's voice through the speaker, deep and warm like it was when he spoke at the Christmas tree lighting. Caleb, I hear you're doing a few things that may cause Evelyn's family more pain. Caleb did not answer. Richard continued. Digging up the dead won't bring anyone back to life. You've had enough tragedy in your life. Don't drag Grace Miller down with you. Grace stepped closer to the phone. What do you know about Evelyn's box? A silence. Then Richard laughed softly. Grace, I've always thought of you as a sensible woman. Don't let an obsessed man turn you into a weapon against the very community that has loved you. The community that has loved you. Grace looked at the red note she had kept in her coat pocket as evidence. Does your community's love come with red tape on my front door? Richard went silent. When he spoke again, his voice had gone colder by one layer. Be careful, Grace. There are some things that, once spoken, cannot be taken back. The next piece of evidence came from the last person Grace expected to help her. Deputy Sam Keene met her behind Lena's diner, in the parking lot where red neon reflected in the puddles, and the smell of frying oil and old coffee drifted out from the back kitchen. Sam had been a young officer when Evelyn died. Now he was in his 40s, his face tired, his eyes always looking as if he had not slept enough. He handed Grace a manila envelope. I'm not giving this to you. You are giving it to me. No, you found it under your windshield after someone dropped it. Grace looked at him. Why now? Sam looked out at the dark street. Because I've been quiet for 12 years, and every time I pass River Bend Bridge, I still see her headlights in my head. Inside the envelope was a copy of the old accident file, including a note the newspaper had never mentioned. At 12:48, almost half an hour before Evelyn died, a 911 call had been made from the payphone near the church. The female caller spoke very quickly. They know I have it. They're going to say it was Caleb. The call cut off. A penciled note in the margin read, likely domestic related. No further action. Grace felt the blood in her body slow. You heard the recording? Sam nodded. The voice sounded a lot like Evelyn. I wanted to follow up. My superior told me the case already had a direction. Not to hurt the family anymore, not to cause a scandal for the church. I was new. I was afraid. He looked at her, shame making his face seem older. Fear is ugly, Grace. It doesn't disappear just because we give it a nicer name like keeping the peace. When Grace walked into the diner afterward, she saw Lena arguing quietly with Margaret Bell in the corner. Lena's face was red, one hand on her hip. Margaret spoke very softly, but softly enough for the blade to go deep. Some people live by misremembering things so they can feel important. Lena turned sharply when she saw Grace. In her eyes was an old fear, finally backed into a corner. After Margaret left, Lena locked the diner door, pulled the blinds, and poured coffee for Grace even though it was far too late. Evelyn came in that night, she said, not looking at Grace. Soaked through, hair stuck to her face, clutching an envelope. Her phone was dead. She asked to use the phone at the end of the counter. Lena pointed toward the wall where a chalkboard menu now hung. She called someone. I didn't hear everything, but I heard her say, "I won't carry your sin." Then she sat down, shaking. I was going to call Caleb, but Evelyn told me not to. She said Caleb didn't understand, that Caleb would tell her to wait, and waiting was the politest way people killed the truth. Grace felt her throat tight. Then what happened? Lena closed her eyes. Richard Bell came in. He wasn't mayor yet, but everyone knew he'd become something. He was very calm, said he would take her home safely, said a woman shouldn't be driving in the rain when she was upset. I thought he was being kind. I let her go with him. Her voice broke on the last sentence. The next morning, Evelyn was dead. Margaret came to the diner before the police ever asked me anything. She said Evelyn's family had been through enough, that if I told anyone Richard had taken Evelyn away, people would twist it into something ugly, that it was best not to make everything worse. I stayed quiet, then I stayed quiet for 1 year. Then 12, Grace asked about the camera. Lena stood, opened the small storage room behind the kitchen, where old VHS tapes were stacked in boxes because her late husband used to save every security recording. They searched until nearly midnight, dust coating their hands. The box from the year Evelyn died was still there, but the tape from the fundraiser week was gone. Lena sat down on the storage room floor, covering her face with her hand. They took it. Grace looked at the empty space on the shelf and understood that they were not just looking for the truth. They were fighting a machine that had had 12 years to learn how to hide. The town struck back as soon as it realized Grace had come too close. Margaret did not need to stand in the square and accuse her. She did what she did best. She planted the right sentences in the right ears. At church, she said Grace was being manipulated by Caleb because she was lonely and soft-hearted. At the clinic, she stopped by with flowers for Dr. Helen and said it was so unfortunate when an employee used church financial records for personal purposes. In the women's group, she said she did not blame Grace, because single women nearing 40 could so easily mistake pity for love. On Facebook, a new account posted that Grace was trying to humiliate Evelyn's memory in order to legitimize her relationship with Evelyn's widower. Clinic put her on indefinite leave. The choir stopped sending rehearsal reminders. An old bookkeeping client pulled her tax file from her hands, saying he didn't want to get involved in town politics. At the small grocery store, 2 women turned away when she walked in. A woman Grace had once made soup for after knee surgery stood by the milk case, saw her, and pulled her daughter into another aisle. Caleb told her to stop. "I'm used to this," he said in the workshop, his face exhausted. "You're not. They'll take everything from you." Grace looked at him, anger making her stand straighter. "You're choosing silence again? I'm choosing to keep you from being crushed." "No, you're choosing to believe they have the right to crush anyone who doesn't stay quiet." Caleb could not answer. But that evening, after a woman from church made a pointed remark to Ruth at the pharmacy about daughters these days breaking their mothers' hearts by chasing scandalous men, Ruth had a mild chest episode and had to go to the emergency room. Grace sat beside her mother's bed under harsh white lights that made everything look unreal, holding Ruth's thin hand, guilt flooding her. "I'm sorry," she whispered. Ruth opened her eyes, tired but clear. "I did not raise you to spend your whole life bowing your head before people who speak God's words but fear the truth." Grace began to cry. Ruth squeezed her hand. "I remember one more thing. The envelope Evelyn dropped. I saw Margaret take it toward Pastor Reed's office. Not back to Evelyn. To him." The sentence pulled Grace out of guilt like a cold hand. This was no longer a scandalous love story. This was a grave with a name on it. That night, Grace and Caleb returned to the church. Not like heroes, but with a very human kind of trembling. Caleb had a key because he still repaired things for the church. A bitter irony so sharp that Grace nearly laughed. The church basement was damp and musty. A weak yellow pull-chain bulb hanging overhead, old fundraiser boxes stacked beside folding chairs. The smell of dust and long-dead candle wax clinging to the throat. They searched for nearly 2 hours. Grace read every label. Caleb pulled cabinets aside, opened boxes, his hands covered in dust. At last, behind the cabinet that held ceremonial cloths in a loose wooden gap, Grace found an old brown envelope, its edges brittle. Inside were copies of bank statements showing money from the shelter fund transferred into an account under Northern Haven Outreach, though the organization's listed address was an empty office in Burlington. A list of approving signatures including Richard Bell, Pastor Reed, and a treasurer who had since died. a blurry still from the outside camera showing Richard and Evelyn arguing in the rain, and a handwritten letter from Evelyn to Clara that had never been sent. Grace opened the letter and read in a shaking voice, "If anything happens to me, don't let them say Caleb was the only reason. He and I fought. He was wrong to tell me to wait, but I was not afraid of Caleb. I was afraid of the people who smile when they pray and sign their names to take money from women who need shelter." Caleb sat down on the stairs, covering his face with his hand. In that moment, Evelyn was no longer a photograph on the wall or a name inside a rumor. She returned as a woman who had tried to speak and had been turned by the whole town into a warning story. As they prepared to leave, the basement lights grew brighter. Pastor Reed stood at the bottom of the stairs, his face pale. He did not call the police right away. He looked at the envelope in Grace's hand and said, "You don't understand what you're holding." Grace answered, "I think I understand better than you want me to." Pastor Reed came down a few steps. "If you make this public, the church will collapse. The shelter will lose funding. Innocent people will suffer. Do you really want to do that just to clear the name of a man you love?" Grace looked at him, and for the first time, she no longer saw a pastor. She saw a man who had used compassion like a cloth to cover rot. "Innocent people have been suffering for 12 years, she said. "They just weren't sitting in the front pews of your church." Pastor Reed's face hardened. "You broke into the basement and stole church records. If I need to, that is what I will say." Caleb stood and stepped beside Grace. "You can say whatever you like. You've had 12 years of practice." Grace did not take the evidence straight to the public. First, she went to Clara Whitcomb's house. Clara, Evelyn's sister, lived in a house filled with photographs of Evelyn, lace curtains, lavender candles, and grief polished until it had become a shrine. When she saw Grace and Caleb at her door, she nearly slammed it shut. "Have you no shame?" she said to Grace, her voice sharp. "Bringing him to my house after everything." Caleb stood still and took it. Grace held out Evelyn's letter. "You need to read this." Clara gave a cold laugh. "I don't need anything from the woman sleeping with my sister's husband." The words struck Grace across the face, but she did not step back. "I'm not here for myself. I'm here for Evelyn." Clara snatched the letter as if she meant to tear it, but when she saw her sister's handwriting, her face changed. She read it standing in the doorway, and then her hands began to shake. When she reached the sentence, "I was not afraid of Caleb," she had to grip the doorframe. There was no loud sobbing, only a small sound escaping her throat, like something locked inside for 12 years finally finding a crack. She sat down on the sofa and read from the beginning again. Caleb did not apologize, perhaps because he knew an apology was too small in the face of 12 years of hatred. Clara looked at him for a long time, her eyes red, her mouth tight. "I don't know what to do with 12 years of hating you," she said. Caleb answered very quietly, "I don't know what to do with 12 years of letting you." The sentence forgave no one, but it opened a door. Clara agreed to stand with Grace at the town meeting Mayor Bell had just announced. An emergency meeting about division and toxic rumor in the community. Grace understood they had built a stage to condemn her and Caleb before she could lay the evidence on the table. But this time, she would not let them choose the light. The town hall was suffocatingly full that night. Wooden chairs stood in rows, the American flag behind the podium, portraits of former mayors on the walls, the smell of damp coats, cheap perfume, coffee in plastic urns, and the ugly anticipation of people who believed they were about to watch someone else be judged. Margaret sat in the front row in a cream-colored coat, her gloves folded neatly in her lap. Pastor Reed sat beside Richard Bell, his face solemn, his hands clasped as if in prayer. Caleb stood at the back of the room, near the door, not because he was afraid to come forward, but because 12 years of being looked at like a stain had taught him to stand near exits. Grace entered with Clara and Lena. The room shifted like one body. Whispers ran across the rows. Grace heard her name, Caleb's name, shame, Evelyn, poor Ruth, all the small blades that had been cutting her for weeks. Richard Bell opened the meeting in the warm voice of a man used to being believed. He spoke about community, responsibility, and the danger of rumors and personal obsession destroying a good town. Margaret was invited to speak. She rose, her eyes moist in exactly the right measure. She spoke about vulnerable women, unfortunate choices, and how compassion did not mean condoning a relationship that dishonored the memory of the dead. Every sentence was a hook set into Grace's skin, pulling her back toward the old role. Bow your head, stay silent, let others define you as good if you know how to suffer politely. Then Richard said, I think it is time we stop reopening old wounds. Grace stood. She did not shout. Her voice trembled at first, but each sentence became clearer. "I agree that rumors can destroy a town," she said. "I know because I have lived inside one for weeks. Caleb Ward has lived inside one for 12 years. Evelyn Ward has been buried inside one even longer than that, because the dead cannot go on Facebook to defend themselves." The room went silent. Margaret shot to her feet. "Grace, this is not appropriate." Grace looked at her. "No, Mrs. Bell, what is not appropriate is you calling the truth inappropriate every time it comes near your husband." A wave of noise broke through the room. Richard struck the podium, demanding order. Grace placed each copy on the front table the way she had once laid out fall fare receipts. The ledger from the year Evelyn died, the shelter money that had been moved, the signatures of Richard Bell and Pastor Reed, the 911 call note, Sam's statement, Lena's account, Evelyn's letter to Clara, the statements from the brown envelope. Sam stood, his face white but his voice steadier than Grace expected, and confirmed that the old 911 record had been ignored. Lena stood beside the water table, gripping her apron in both hands, and told them Evelyn had come into the diner, had made a call, had said, "I won't carry your sin," and that Richard Bell had taken her away. Clara stood last, holding Evelyn's letter with both hands, and read the part where her sister wrote that she had not been afraid of Caleb, that she had been afraid of people who smiled when they prayed, and signed their names to take money from women who needed shelter. When Clara finished reading, the air in the hall changed. Not into justice. Justice was too clean for that room. It changed into something more uncomfortable. People who had eaten, sung, prayed, and judged together were suddenly forced to see their own faces in dirty glass. Margaret tried to save the story one last time. She stood, her voice shaking with anger while still holding on to the shell of politeness. "Grace Miller has been blinded by love. We all know she is no longer objective." Grace turned toward her. "No, I was taught by this town that silence is kindness. Today I am not being kind in that way anymore." Richard Bell did not confess to killing Evelyn, because perhaps he had not killed her directly. The truth was colder and more uncomfortable than that. He had threatened her, taken her from the diner, concealed the embezzlement, and allowed Caleb to become the scapegoat when the accident happened. Pastor Reed had hidden the envelope. Margaret had built the story around Caleb and later around Grace, to protect her husband, the church, and her own soft power. The River Bend accident may still have been an accident. The car may truly have slipped off the bridge in the rain. Evelyn may truly have died because of a curve in the road and the weather. But everything after that was not an accident. 12 years of rumor was not an accident. 12 years of Caleb being seen as his wife's killer was not an accident. The red note on Grace's door was not an accident. It was a system of hypocrisy protecting itself by calling the victim the troublemaker. When the meeting ended, no one applauded. Some people looked down, some hurried out, some cried because they realized they had been deceived. But Grace no longer had enough softness left to comfort them. Caleb looked at her from the back of the room, not like a man who had been saved, but like someone who understood she had just lost the town in order to return the truth to him and to Evelyn. Grace stepped outside, and the cold cut against her skin. The white church in the distance was still lit. She looked at it and no longer saw home. The weeks that followed offered Grace no kind reward. Richard Bell came under investigation. Pastor Reed stepped down temporarily. Margaret disappeared from the women's group gatherings, but Ashford Falls did not come back to embrace Grace. A few people offered small apologies, very small, in grocery aisles or outside the post office, saying they hadn't known, saying everything was so complicated, saying they hoped she understood that everyone had only been trying to keep the community peaceful. Grace learned that apologies from people who had stayed silent often wanted forgiveness faster than they wanted to understand the pain they had caused. The clinic did not invite her back. The choir had an empty seat, but no one called. The church found someone new to help with the books. Some women still avoided her eyes, no longer because they thought she was wrong, but because looking at her reminded them that they had been. Caleb was seen differently, but he was not cleansed the way people are in fairy tales. More people brought chairs and cabinets to the workshop, but they still spoke to him carefully, as if he were a house that had once burned and they were not sure the ashes were cool. Grace and Caleb still loved each other, but their love was no longer a romantic secret inside the woodshop. It was something that had passed through fire and carried the smell of smoke. Some evenings they sat in Grace's kitchen while Ruth slept in the next room, Caleb drinking coffee, Grace looking over a list of tasks, as she tried to find new bookkeeping work in another town. They did not speak much about the future, not because they did not love each other, but because both of them had learned that truth does not automatically build a new home on top of wreckage. One Sunday morning afterward, Grace put on a heavy coat and walked past the church without going inside. The bells were ringing. People climbed the steps in good coats, hair neatly combed, faces solemn. Donna saw her from a distance and lifted her hands slightly, a gesture half greeting, half apology. Grace nodded and kept walking. In the back of Caleb's truck was the church pew he had restored, the old wood still scarred, but the frame solid, the surface sanded smooth, the leg pins replaced. They brought it to the women's shelter, newly reopened with transparent funding, a small house at the edge of town, its new sign still smelling of paint. Grace placed her hand on the back of the pew, feeling the grain beneath her palm. Caleb stood beside the truck and said nothing. Ruth had once told her that people did not need a church to have a conscience, but sometimes they needed to lose the church to learn where their conscience truly stood. Grace looked at the shelter sign, at the open door waiting for women she had never met, and felt not relief, but a cold form of standing upright. She had lost her reputation in town, lost her place in the choir, lost her job, lost the version of Grace Miller Ashford Falls had once praised because she knew when to lower her head. But she no longer needed them to call her good in order to know she had done the right thing. Ashford Falls still had its white church, its diner, its freshly painted fences, and its people whispering behind curtains. But after that meeting, the town could no longer pretend that morality was what it had protected for 12 years. What it had protected was only a mask. Grace Miller had lost her seat in the choir, but she had kept her voice. And as she stepped through the shelter door, her back straight, her hand still carrying the scent of old wood from the pew Caleb had restored, she understood that this did not heal her, did not return everything she had lost, did not erase the weeks of being smeared from her skin. But it meant she no longer bowed her head. For Grace, after a lifetime of being loved for her silence, that was the cruelest price and the only truth solid enough to stand on.